Yes?
Yes.
Okay, I'll get started then. All right, so I'd like to give a really brief overview on a project that we've been doing for the past 2 years. Co-authors on the report are myself, Felipe Chavez Ramirez, who I believe either is on or will be on.
I'm on.
As well as, oh good, thanks Felipe. And Liz Lum with a graduate student that is working on her thesis on this, and James Chabot is her advisor and at the Heart Research Institute. So the funding was provided by the Gulf Coast Prairies Landscape Conservation Cooperative Program, as well as Meadows Foundation for my time on the project. As Bill mentioned, we had several people on the project team that helped us in various ways. The Mission Aransas NERV with stakeholder facilitation, Nature Conservancy with private lands access, Luz with the project, the GIS project, Felipe working with developing the Avian and habitat connections, and myself with the GIS habitat development, crosswalks, etc. And I welcome any questions that come up that if Felipe can answer them better, then please, I'd appreciate that. Okay, this is the project area for the GCP LCC, and then in white is our project area on the central Gulf Coast of Texas. Basically, we were following the elements in the Strategic Conservation Framework. Those highlighted in yellow are the parts where we contributed to end up developing a species habitat decision support tool, which we then used several species as examples, but also trying to create some very practical deliverables. We had several objectives of which I'll go through today. The report is organized under these objectives, and so I will go over them, but basically we were creating this habitat type database. We were focusing a lot on the whooping crane because we had the most information for that, and that was our target species initially. We also evaluated it for several other avian species, and then we identified future conservation needs, particularly in climate change and sea level rise for these species, and then provided recommendations. We delineated the pilot project area among 3 bay systems. The inland portion was defined by using a Category 5 hurricane storm tide inundation using the SLOSH model. And then we evaluated 17 different types of databases to develop our composite habitat type data set, and ended up using 3. The Texas Ecological Systems database was developed by Texas Parks and Wildlife, a National Wetlands Inventory that is a Fish and Wildlife Service product. Primarily we used the update by the SLAM model developers for Aransas, and the NOAA Benthic Habitat Atlas. And from this then we had a comprehensive coverage of our area. A lot of work was put into combining this database into across different hierarchical levels of classification, and to end up being in our CHTD, the Composite Habitat Type Database, at a macro habitat, meso habitat, and micro habitat type level. I could give a whole thing on that, but we don't want to do that. Okay, so we ended up with 7 macro habitats that mostly upland was used by the from the PESD data. The NWI we use for both the palustrine freshwater wetlands and the estuarine intertidal. The benthic habitat atlas, we use the estuarine seagrass, oyster reef, and mangrove components. We ended up with 29 meso, 107 micro habitats, and the coverage of the pilot area was 1.7 million acres with all or parts of 8 counties. So our second objective was to evaluate the conservation needs for the whooping crane. And briefly, the approach was to use point data from Fish and Wildlife Service winter surveys. This was one of the key reasons for taking this approach, since we had this database. And then we joined each of those points to a land cover class, which when we take the land cover class and use it in the context of an avian species, we end up with a habitat type, which is how I'll refer to it from here on. Then rank the frequency of that habitat type for high, low, and incidental use using that data, and then construct our potential use areas. Now also we wanted to have a spatial objective, a goal, and the number of nesting pair equals the number of wintering territories. 250 territories is listed in the recovery plan as a downlisting goal. The wintering territories we estimated at being 500 acres each from the literature. And so the area needed to meet our first recovery goal was 125,000 acres. So we used data from 2004 and 5 to 2010-11 winter to link these points to our habitat type. And we used that because our data were in that range. The land cover data that we used, et cetera. And so we had quite a bit of information to generate our frequency index, and we covered several different peninsulas and barrier islands with that data. So each one of those yellow dots is a point in the database. From that, then, we determined that whooping cranes used the estuarine intertidal emergent marsh regularly flooded 39% of the time, whereas the irregularly flooded would use 6% and the irregularly exposed 3%. And then also shown here are the acreages within the pilot area that were available for each one of those habitat types. Now, one of the issues that we came up with at the microhabitat level was that most of our emergent marsh is actually irregularly flooded. So we had to go up one level to the estuarine vegetated marsh because of that. And one of our recommendations is to ground truth that data set. So when we did that, we ended up with estuarine vegetated marsh as 50% of the relative frequency of use, and that was given a potential use index of 3. And then estuarine open water, which is at shallow water, and shallow seagrass has a 2, and then 12 other habitat, mesohabitat types were included into the 1s. So when you map that using the database, you see that the that in purple is the high use, that of the estuarine emergent marsh. And then low use is actually that open water area. And incidental use in orange is all those other types. Now you see that because those other types are just generated by where they occur on the landscape, and if they were just incidentally used, it actually increases the overall amount of potential use by the whooping crane. So we just are going to look at the high use for now and refer to the report for more explanation. And that ended up being 104,000 acres within our pilot project area. We also had some issues with the twos, which in the low use of looking at that open water habitat, the database was not comprehensive, and also we had some issues with the whether they used mean water tide level or if they used low water tide level. So those are in the future recommendations to evaluate as well. So we'll focus on the high use. Okay, so then for the other species, in order to select those species, we had a couple of stakeholder workshops. The first one was held in June of 2012, and we identified 25 species from 7 avian gills. We would then use the database and qualitative information, since we didn't have point data like we did with the whooping crane, to develop the high, low, and incidental use index. And then we showed those results at a stakeholder workshop in July of 2013. And we had Commissioner Ramsey-Snur was able to poll the stakeholders as we showed the maps to determine if their level of confidence in the map. And we did identify quite a bit of data gaps. And so we selected then 5 species with various management and conservation goals and developed the data and the information for each of those species. We did include those 25 species, though, what we did have in results for that workshop, too, in an appendix. So this is the breakdown of those 25 species in those different gills. And we did want to have as much diversity as possible in the original intent of doing these species. The additional 5 species besides the whooping crane that we selected were the apple motto falcon, the loggerhead shrike, northern bobwhite, the LeConte sparrow, and seaside sparrow. So when we just use the database as viewing it from habitat types that are identified as being used by this species, we see pretty fair coverage across the whole pilot project area. But we know that these birds are not typically using areas that have wooded areas within them where predators such as owls could work from. So we were able to use the database to buffer around 1 mile around all woodland habitat type areas, and the resulting map comes out where you see how much area is potentially available for these species. Now, some of these areas, there may be birds that actually do occur in areas not shown on this map, and that's where further information is needed. In this case, we believe that the habitat types, the land covers used, need to be further refined with ground truthing. So basically, we have a lot of habitat is along the barrier islands, and then there are some isolated pockets in the mainland area. The loggerhead shrike, fairly broad coverage, although much more less aerial coverage in the high use. Northern bobwhite, again, a species that uses a lot of different upland habitats. And this species, we also did some other calculations, or tried to, in looking at what the carrying capacity or the density was for this species. The database could be used for evaluating more specific land management practices, as just having a habitat type does not connote quality. But once you get at the spatial level, you should be able to do that with the right data. The LeConte sparrow, another upland and barrier island species that has a fairly broad coverage, much more concentrated on the barrier islands. And we also, just to show an example of a management scenario of what areas have greater than 500 acres of adjacent high and low use habitat types. And so we're able to then parse out the data to give those results, as such as shown here for the LeConte sparrow. The seaside sparrow is another species that you really need to have an additional filter, as the species does not occur in habitats that would be considered upland, but further than 0.6 miles from the shoreline. So that's shown what is illuminated in that beige color and what is actually more used along the coastal shoreline. So these examples show us that once we have spatial information, we can develop the rules to create buffers and masks to further refine the database for a specific species or guild. Okay, so then to identify future conservation needs for these 6 species, we use the sea level affecting marshes model, the SLAM model. For these, we actually, in the report, we also used A1B max, but I'm just going to show the 3 listed here. Now, the SLAM model does not cover the entire pilot project area. It covers the areas around, within and around the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. And so potential high use is the criteria for the whooping crane that we used in purple. And then the estuarine and marine open water is that mass relegated to less than 0.6 meters of depth. And it's depicted here just to show how much area will be reclassified to open water as sea level rises. So if we go through the scenario for the A1B mean, which is 0.69 meters of sea level rise by 2100, you see that we have a decrease in habitat, primarily along the barrier islands and the eastern shorelines of the peninsulas, a little bit more on the Guadalupe Peninsula or delta, which is in the middle there. When we look at the 1 meter sea level rise, we see a lot more of the high-use habitat has been lost and converted to open water. And when we employ the 2 meter sea level rise, we actually start getting an increase back in our area. So when we look at this over time, and I've also included the light blue bar, which is the 2075 time frame, you see that at the A1B mean and the 1 meter scenario, we continue to lose habitat. However, at the 2 meter, we actually lose habitat very similarly to the other 2, but then we gain back about 23% of that habitat. And that's basically because of that sea level go over washing onto the next low-lying area on the landscape. But overall, we will be estimated to lose between 23 and 54% of our habitat in the area by 2100 under these scenarios. Now, for the other species, because the SLAM model doesn't utilize upland habitat in its conversions, it's primarily for estuarine habitat, we did a different scenario where we looked at habitat that would be lost at 1 and 2 meter elevation contours in relation to the habitat selected for the species. And here you see that most of the 0 to 1 meter habitat areas are located along the fringing shorelines, would be expected, and into the back barrier islands and in the delta. And then the 1 to 2 meter are higher up on the barrier islands as well as up secondary and tertiary bays and creeks. So for these upland species, then we get a variable amount of response to this. For the upland mottled falcon, we're actually losing most of the habitat that is available now on the barrier islands due to sea level rise at 2 meters. And certainly there are some areas in the inland portions and that upland 1 mile buffer is applied where we would still have potential habitat. So some recommendations may be to be evaluating that as we move along in conservation strategy. Just to note that the habitat loss at 1 meter of sea level rise does not show up here, as the bird does not use those habitats currently, in the first place. The northern bobwhite is not as affected by the sea level rise scenarios, with the exception, again, of the barrier islands and the line areas around those back bays. And the loggerhead shrike, a similar situation, losing that habitat on the barrier islands, but still maintaining habitat in the mainland. The conch sparrow, again, similar. But all losing habitat within our pilot project area along fringing shoreline. The seaside sparrow is one of the species that we actually are only looking at what habitat would be lost by upland habitat use, and also we would then need to apply the SLAM model for those habitats that it uses in the estuarine portion. So this method is limited in that it only shows loss, and as we know, in that 2 meter scenario, we would actually be gaining habitat for the seaside sparrow again. Okay, and then we also wanted to look at how we would use this information for conservation. So we identified 18 different tracts of land that met the definition of being either in an acquisition or a conservation easement, and that the natural habitat would be managed into perpetuity. And this is the map of that. And then we took all of these and applied them to determine how much habitat is protected for each species and how much is unprotected. So for the whooping crane, we actually have 25,000 acres that are protected and about 66,000 acres that are unprotected at this time that they would potentially use. Note the orange boxes. These are areas that actually have been identified, misclassified, and are classified as estuarine habitat that we removed from the calculation and need to be refined in the database. So we do not meet that 125,000 acre goal in this area. And of course, the future management recommendation would be to expand the area to determine where that is. For the other species, we have variable amounts that are in the protected areas, and of course we see that a lot of this is in the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge areas. Bobwhite, a majority of the habitat being on private land, which is where most of the focus is in management strategy. Copperhead shrike, similarly. The conch, and the seaside sparrow. So we hope that by using this, we can actually look and find out areas that are important for each species, but collectively for several species where a conservation strategy would benefit more than one species, which we know to be true. And so for the future recommendations, they are by objective in the report, but basically for the first one, to refining the composite habitat type data set, we do need to have some ground truthing conducted in both the estuarine emergent marsh portion as well as the grassland microhabitat type for a more useful data set at that level. To evaluate the conservation needs for whooping cranes, we do have more information that will be forthcoming about where birds are expanding to, and as they expand out of this area, that they might be actually shifting their use to other habitat types that should be included. For the selected avian species, we just, it's very limited in what you can do quantitatively when you don't have point data like we do for the whooping crane. So surveys would be very helpful in linking them to their respective habitat type. And then as far as sea level, we recognize that sea level rise in a coastal area will have an impact on coastal species, but that areas that will be inundated in the future should be included in conservation planning even now. And then we also have some other recommendations for the project as well. One of those being that we increase the planting area for these and other species to cover the entire Gulf Coast prairie ecoregion. And with that, I can take any questions.
Liz, we had a question here in the Wetland Center conference room as to when the report would be made available to the general public and to the partners.
Okay. We are finishing it up right now. We have what we hope to be a final meeting with the technical reviewers tomorrow to address anything that they had from the July review. We think that we have covered all of that and hope that we will be posting it here very quickly. It'll be on the LCC website as well as links to other areas. And also wanted to mention that the data bases, the GIS layers, will be available as well. And Blair, if you could say where that's going to be.
The data is going to be available on the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC's Conservation Planning Atlas. I can put this recording will be posted to our website, and I can post a link to that, to the CPA gallery with all of this information on it as well, so that you can all see it.
And use it. Because one of the strengths of this is that we developed our habitat use frequency indices, and those can be amended. So, it's a living database and document.
Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but
Liz, I have one more question for you, and that was those models of the habitat frequency use indices. Were those validated at all, and did you use only expert opinion, or did you use some literature as well to determine those?
Okay. We didn't have any validation in this project. That certainly is an essential step moving forward with any of the species. Knowing how it's going to be used in a spatial database really helps determine what data needs to be collected when you go out in the field as well. As far as how we selected those, certainly we really wanted to limit ourselves to literature sources. And so I think that using expert opinion would be certainly a great resource in lieu of lack of that information, especially for our area. But that would need to be done, that really needs to be done in a more extensive way, which we did not have the time or the resources to do. So these are just starting points. And certainly looking at those models and looking at the results, at least you have something to start from to say, I think I would add, I have information that says that this species uses other habitats than what has been selected in different frequencies.
Hey Liz, this is Mike Brazier. I have a question. So early on in this process, I remember I saw something, maybe it was back when we were trying to select the focal species, and there were a couple of waterfowl species on there. And so is there a reason that some of those didn't make the final cut in terms of, did you find certain issues with certain habitat classifications that wouldn't work for those species?
Right. Actually, most of the species that we selected are being worked on by other projects that are going to provide the information that you would be able to put into this database. And so for that reason, we did not focus on them and focused on other species of which not much work was being done on. Felipe, can you add to that?
Well, yeah, part of the technical committee also thought that we had way too many species for this. But all the species, however, do have all the summary tables and maps in an appendix. So even though they're not treated directly in the body of the report, all the species have maps and summary tables as an appendix.
Okay. Yeah, my main interest was in learning if y'all discovered something in the modeling process that made them less than desirable candidates, and so no, I can understand having to make those kind of choices. So thanks.
Yeah, it wasn't. We weren't picking on waterfowl. If that's the
well, why would you?
Hey Liz, this is Chris Pease. I have a question. How do you guys figure in the potential transition of some of these marsh habitats towards greater density of black mangrove in time?
Right. One of the benefits of having using the benthic habitat atlas was a fairly good representation of mangroves was mapped in that effort. There are some studies ongoing in Texas and certainly in Louisiana where we're looking at that encroachment expansion of black mangroves and really in understanding what it is replacing. And so once we were able to identify those spatial parameters, then we would be able to produce a preliminary model of what we feel like would be changed by mangrove establishment. Certainly we have an area that's going to be very interesting to watch with the opening of Cedar Bayou in Mesquite Bay, as that area did not have mangroves thickly established there, but with the opening of the pass, it may give us some insight into how that establishes where, at what elevation and distance from the pass. So, you know, there's things that we really want to make sure we capture as we move along to be able to incorporate in the model. So at this point, no, not really being able to say uniformly it will replace irregularly flooded emergent marsh or tidal flats, et cetera. And there's more parameters we need.
But thanks.
Okay, Liz, is there any more questions for Liz before we wrap up the discussion? If not, I just wanted to reiterate a couple things that Liz mentioned, that this is truly a working document, and it's out there for us as conservation partners to build on. And I think it sets a very good foundation for some of the questions that were brought up here after the call, as well as future questions that have to do with the changing habitat conditions on the Gulf Coast and how that affects the many species that we're concerned about. So Again, this is Bill Bardish wanting to thank everyone who joined in. Our estimate is probably about 40 some odd people either on the phone or on the webinar or here in the conference room. So it was well attended, and the information will be posted on our website, as well as the maps on the Conservation Planning Atlas, which you'll have a link to from the website. And stay tuned, because our website is in the midst of a serious makeover, and expect a new and invigorating Gulf Coast Prairie website in the very near future. With that, Liz, any last words?
No, thank everyone for listening, and certainly provide any feedback that you wish. It's been a challenge, but a real learning experience, and Felipe and I have, you know, it's been great to be able to get to this level.
Okay, any last thoughts or questions from anyone online? If not, thank you all, and please feel free to comment, send an email to us here at the Gulf Coast Prairie or Liz Smith, and we will have another webinar, third in our series, next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.